Hi, folks. Welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. As you know, this is the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to spread progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking. And in this episode, I'm talking to Shawn from the Srsly Wrong podcast. This is a conversation I wanted to have for quite some time. I really enjoy their show. It's very funny, it's very entertaining, and it's very educational. I think that they do a valuable service in promoting a type of utopian idealism within left-wing spheres. Like, we may not always see eye to eye, but the idea that we're all working towards some ultimate good society that actually has the best interests of every citizen in mind is really at the heart of why I am on the left, why I am a leftist, and why I believe in the philosophies that I do. So having a chat with Shawn was really cool. I really enjoyed talking to him. Because of the new format of the show, I'm going to be probably only putting half 30 minutes to 40 minutes of the interview into this episode. And as much as I hate putting a paywall between you and good content, I'm going to have to put part of this interview in for patrons only. Putting stuff for patrons only, as much as I dislike having a paywall for content, helps me keep those patrons happy, as well as keeps me some incentive for people to continue to be a patron or to start being a patron. As much as I do work, I have a job now. I'm not just doing gig economy work, but that also means I have less time to devote to creative work. And that means that I have to put some stuff behind a paywall. It's just how it works. Unfortunately, this is the way that things are. I don't like doing that. And honestly, if you're interested enough and you email me that you would like the full episode, I will send it to you. But as it is, half of this interview will be on the patron only feed, or on the main feed, and the other half will be the full episode. Full interview will be with the patron only feed. Also, I'm going to start doing a conservative cancel culture segment where I talk about the various ways that conservatives have canceled whatever. The first thing that I plan to talk about is the movie Footloose. For a lot of people, I guess you might only know the remake, but the original Footloose came out when I was young, and it represented something that we all, at my age, all thought was absolutely ridiculous. The town in Footloose was a town that banned dancing. And according to Wikipedia, Footloose is loosely based on the town of Elmore City, Oklahoma, a town that banned dancing since it was founded in 1898 because it wanted to decrease drinking or alcohol consumption. One person who was in favor of it was the Reverend from the nearby town of Hennepin. His name was F.R. Johnson, and he said, "No good has ever come from a dance. If you have a dance, somebody will crash it, and they will be looking for only two things, women and booze. When boys and girls hold each other, they get sexually aroused. You can believe what you want, but one thing leads to another." So, I don't know about you, but that's not a social justice perspective. That's not a left-wing perspective. That's clearly a conservative perspective, banning dancing in an entire town. Because of the ban on dancing, there was never a prom in that town. And in February of 1980, the junior class of Elmore City's high school requested permission to hold a junior prom, and they did get that permission granted. But this is what I mean when I talk about conservative cancel culture. The people who talk about cancel culture, or the left is trying to cancel everything and everybody, they're just trying to make excuses. They are the top of the canceling things and shutting things down and boycotting things pyramid. The conservative movement, this is their thing that they've done for so long. And then when it happens on the left, then they get all outraged and pissed off because it's not the thing that they think deserves to be canceled. Meanwhile, they literally, like, the conservative ideology is literally responsible for an entire town going without dancing from 1898 until 1980. So this is the start of a series that I'm going to be doing every 2 weeks. I'm going to have one little, very short snippet on something that they are canceling on the right or have canceled in the past. Because this is just ridiculous. We have the receipts and it's time to show them. With that, I'm going to lead you into my interview with Shawn from Srsly Wrong, and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to spread progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking. Today I am joined by Shawn from the Srsly Wrong podcast. And,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad we could connect finally. It's a process sometimes when people are busy.
Oh yeah, and the pandemic has just made clocks have a totally different character altogether. So I'm glad that we managed to line it up.
So I guess to start off, what is a little bit of your background and what is your political identity, or what brand do you follow?
Cool, yeah. My name's Shawn, and our show, Srsly Wrong, that we do is like a comedy leftist podcast where we do sort of like sketch comedy interviews and, try to exercise critical thinking and promote good ideas, especially ideas that are like outside of the mainstream where they might sound a little bit weird at first, and then trying to like build the intellectual basis for them. Like broadly politically speaking, I align with, I guess, like social ecology, or the space between anarchism and Marxism, and even a little bit of sort of social democracy sometimes, depending on how it's done. I also identify sort of specifically with this term library socialism, which is a term that we use on the show sometimes to talk about basically the core insight of library socialism. And this comes from social ecology, and I think it connects to pretty much any form of leftism should be able to bring on some of these ideas. But the basic idea is that the library is a space that is non-commodified, and it's a space that shows sort of a map of a way that we could be in society that isn't based on commodities, where there's use rather than ownership. Murray Bookchin, who founded social ecology, he put it like, the environmental crisis is a social crisis. We have these two big issues, which is the overuse of resources in society and the destruction of the environment. But then also resources aren't being distributed to the people who need them. So, capitalism has been good at producing innovations and variations and, creating wealth, as they say. But it's never distributed. It's never, we have the most advanced washing machines that have ever been created, but there's places all over the world where they don't have access to them. So What use is it? So library socialism basically says we got these two big crises, and we already have this thing called the lending library, the public library, that shows a model of how we can address both of these crises at once by producing less things and providing access to more people. So you're able to address the issue of the absence of things that people need, and you can address the issue of the overproduction of the climate crisis in one fell swoop, using sort of like a social mechanical mechanism that we've already tried and tested for generations, called the public library. So that's my elevator pitch, my bumper sticker for library socialism. It's something that I see a lot of people sort of reflecting this also now these days. There's a lot of conversation about what this could mean. So, that's something I'm passionate about. And as you know, I was on your podcast Brainstorm years back. I was the leader of the Pirate Party of Canada briefly when I was a young man of 20, and then later when I was 24, youngest party leader in Canada. I got 188 votes when I ran for office in 2015, which was I kind of regret. I told my friends, it doesn't matter if you vote for me. But I wish I really had like 230. I'd feel a little better about it. But
188 votes is more than anyone else that I know.
Yeah, and after that, actually, I worked with some social democratic parties, the NDP here in Canada. I was a campaign manager, I was a campaign manager once for the NDP and once for a municipal campaign. So I've got a little bit of experience on that end too, of like, what it takes to run campaigns and stuff like that. It hasn't been all, starry-eyed dreaming, but I found that I preferred the starry-eyed dreaming by quite a lot. And, but yeah, so that's sort of politically where I'm coming from. And
I know we're going to talk about epistemology or truth a little bit here, but one of the things that you kind of talk about on your podcast is like a utopian vision, and how utopianism isn't this thing to be made fun of the way that a lot of like cynics really like to make fun of. I wonder if you can like explain where you kind of come from on that a little bit. Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. When I was a young, like, I can't remember how old I was pretty apolitical. And I remember having this thought like, oh, we have all these problems with society. Like, what's the name for when you make society good? Like, what's the name for, and around like, I think it was around Occupy, I heard Slavoj Žižek say, we used to call that communism. And it clicked for me. I was like, oh, like communism was about utopia. Oh, like that just makes sense. But then, so I had this sense of like, why don't we use the word utopia? And it wasn't until years and years later that through Aaron, who I do the podcast with, we used to joke around about world peace and stuff. It's another thing that, like, when you hear world peace, you think of like a beauty pageant or something. Like, I wish for world peace, but it's like, who's against world peace? Like, can we make that work?
Why aren't we at least trying?
Yeah, like it's almost like verboten to say the things that we actually know that we need, because they sound sort of like too Pollyanna. And that was part of the reason I really like vibed and clicked with social ecology and Murray Bookchin, and specifically Dan Chodakov, who co-founded the Institute for Social Ecology. He wrote this awesome book called The Anthropology of Utopia. And he's articulated a really, really great way of thinking about utopia that clicked with the way that I used to think of it, or that it sort of occurred to me. And he says like that the utopian process is just it's a process in politics that we can either describe it or not, but it's a good thing to describe it. It's a good thing to do it consciously, which is by setting like, sort of waypoints in the future, by setting like a waypoint in the future where you can think of like the society that you want to create, then it helps guide what you're doing in the present. And it's not like a permanent blueprint where you're like, this is how it must be. There's a famous example. I think it's actually in Thomas More's Utopia. He believed that every neighborhood should be like pods on a bean, every one of them identical, so you can never get lost. And the ocean should turn to lemonade. And then it turned out that the oceans kind of did turn to lemonade, but in a different way through like acidification. But
except not good.
Yeah. So, and utopia is kind of, I think foundationally it was a pun. So this is sort of my theory on, well, I'll split up what's my theory and what I know for sure. What I know for sure is that utopia it means both, the good place and no place. So there's like e-utopia, which it means the good place, and there's utopia, which means no place. And Thomas More's utopia was sort of like a pun on that, and being like, the perfect is impossible was sort of part of the premise. And it's like a little bit of a self-aware thing. And my sort of interpretation of that is it's almost kind of like how the court jester can say things to the king that other people can't say, kind of thing.
Okay.
So that, and I see that as part of the appeal of utopia too, is like by going a little bit ridiculous and being like, this is how perfect it could be, and describing that and thinking through it like science fiction. You can get a little bit through that ridiculousness. You get a little bit more, metaphorical coverage from the king to really, really subvert the order. And so that's part of what like really draws me to utopia. But broadly speaking, like, yeah, I sort of take I think the more we do science fiction and imaginative sort of thinking about the world that we want to create, the better off we'll be. I mean, there's that famous quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And the reason for that is because there's thousands and thousands, if not millions of dollars put into destroying the imagination of all of us, so we can't imagine an alternative. So if they care so much about preventing us from imagining alternatives, that's a pretty good endorsement for like trying to figure out some alternatives.
For sure.
And library socialism sort of came out of that process too, of like, we were, just trying to boldly describe the way it should be. And, Bookchin used this term usufruct, which is like an anthropological term for types of, pre-capitalist property relationships. So like where where like ownership is basically based on use and you're just sort of like handing it off. And that, like we're a group of people, like a good example is like on a work site, you have a collective amount of tools. And if you're like, hey, pass me that hammer, no one's like, all right, $5, I'll pass you that hammer, because you're all doing something together.
It's my hammer.
So, I mean, under our system, technically that hammer is owned by someone, and ultimately at the end of the day, they have recourse to like a political authority to prevent people from stealing it or whatever, technically.
Right.
But in, pre-literate societies and the vast majority of human history, we've lived with sort of usufructian property relationships as a normal thing in our lives. We didn't have this like sort of idea of, oh, this is mine and it belongs to me and there's some sort of psychic connection between me and it. That's what I always think of with property. It's maybe not the most generous interpretation, but, this history is something that Bookchin talks about in The Ecology of Freedom. And it really just, it captured my imagination in this way of like, how do you scale up that dynamic to an information, a techno-information society that is, even beyond the dreams of me? Like, how can this dynamic be applied in the real world in ways using technology and connectedness and all these things that we have to create a society that works for everyone? And that was sort of the starting point. And we found, since we started talking to it too, so many people have like written back to us and been like, here's a library socialist take on like food production, or here's a library socialist. And they're like taking some of these ideas and then applying them to their expertise and their specialties. And it's like it's the most awesome thing ever. And then I keep on hearing about like other people, like you see these viral tweets every now and then. It's like 100,000 likes and someone's like, maybe we should have a society like a library. And it's like, yeah. And it's like, it just keeps on like popping up. It's like people are, I feel like we're just sort of like all figuring it out together. It's like we have this tool right here, and it's like the libraries can completely restructure society, and it like society or libraries provide a map for what society could be like. I was just thinking the other day, because I read, or it was actually today, I read this article about how libraries, like prison libraries, are an important part of like bringing people out of the prison system and into society, and sort of like getting them ready for a life in society. And that there's a sort of tension between prisons and libraries. There's this fascinating connection between these two things. Like there's even examples of former prisons being turned into libraries. And I'm also a prison abolitionist, in the spirit of Kropotkin, and in the spirit of many others who said, hey, this is kind of crazy to lock people in cages and treat them this poorly. It seems to be, I think Kropotkin called it a nursery of criminality. Right. So libraries help keep it from being a nursery of criminality, and instead of training people to be better criminals, it helps train people to legitimately understand what they've done wrong, if they've done wrong, and then also connect with the outside of society. So I was thinking about this and like, how many crimes in our society could be solved by having a ultra library beyond our wildest dreams, where say there's a place you can go where if you need something, you can get it, you can borrow it at the very least, whether it's like clothes or shelter or whatever, the things that you need, you can borrow. And like food obviously is not something you can borrow, but I mean, you sort of give it back in a way, but but still, like I consider the dispensing of food as part of the library socialist issue. Right. So how many we know that crime is like a social construct, and disproportionately people are being punished for, their lot in life rather than their actual actions or their morality or lack thereof. But if you set up society where there were like omnipresent, large scale library institutions, where would like theft would become such a small thing? And so like, if you take away the need, theft becomes this sort of like very deliberative act of a very specific type of person. And then even then it's like it's all about this like financial incentive within the system. And it's again about trying to get your needs met. So if people's needs are met, I really think a lot of the things that we see that are wrong with society, or that we consider wrong with society, and the way that people can sort of turn against each other, is caused by lashing out from that absence. And again, libraries provide a model, or at least a framework to think through what an alternative might be like. Because yeah, like the library, it's like a book reading program. It's like a program to have more people read books. I feel like if you pitch that in 2020, people are like, how would you get enough books for everyone? What if two people wanted the same book?
We can't do that. That doesn't work. Yeah, no, I've even like, one of my things is one of my jobs is a gig job. I drive for Uber. And I was on a guest on another podcast, and they asked me about, what I do, what I think about how society could work. And I even used like your kind of library socialism theory to be like, okay, if I drive for Uber, and it's something that I enjoy, but what if I don't have to own the car? What if it's a car that, I just pick up and then I drive people around for the day, and that's my duty for the day. That's my contribution to the society that we're in. I don't have to get paid for it if my needs are met. And I don't have to own the car if it's society's car, if we all kind of care for it in a sense. I mean, I didn't really flesh it out 100%, but it was kind of like, okay, I enjoy driving people around. I can contribute to society this way. But also, we would probably have better public transit too. But
on that note, actually, I've thought about this before, the public transit and Uber thing. I've got this just a wild idea, so maybe you can think about it further when you're on the road or whatever, maybe someone in the audience. But I feel like it makes a lot of sense to integrate things like the Uber driving economy, or like the sort of like swarm economy around transportation, to integrate it more consciously with public transit systems, and to consider them part of one system that fill the gaps in each other's needs. And if you could set up a system where like people can hop on as basically, transit drivers. And, I think some of these apps already do this, where you have multiple people picked up on one trip and stuff like that. Yeah. But you could really, if we wanted to, and if there was the money in it, but because this is a political, I'm proposing something political, so it would need to be done by like committees and institutions, and it has to be recommended by so and so and so and so, and like, and actually we'll do it after the second re-election and all that. But if it was done, and it's going to cost money to set up, so oh my God, they're raising our taxes for it's a fun game, figuring out like public policy. But I think if you integrate them, you can really have them play to each other's strengths and weaknesses in a way that, prevents drivers from being exploited, continues and maintains the user experience that people like. Because we sort of take a heterodox position on our show that we're in favor of good user experiences. Like when people, what makes these institutions powerful is the way that they're convenient and the way that they're, that people get used to using them. So I think an important thing that we should do on the left when we're creating our utopia is try to keep the parts that people really like, while getting rid of all the things that make us feel sick to our stomach. And I think it's totally possible with something like the gig economy. If people's needs are met, people aren't being exploited. And I think it makes sense with transport to integrate it into a public transit system. You could have it so like your bus pass has credit that can be used on taxis and vice versa and stuff, like treat transportation as one public good, and make sure that when we're making public transit decisions, or we're making transit decisions as a region, we're considering all the different types of transit that people take, and how, different levels of convenience and stuff like that. I think there's a richer conversation to have if we consider both of these as part of the same ecosystem. For sure. Yeah.
Like you say, like the drivers in the vehicles could be in areas where bus routes maybe don't work, or, after certain hours. I mean, in a lot of ways, Uber or taxis already do this, right? If buses don't run after 9 p.m. on a Saturday, well, the workers in that area who work till 11, they still have to get transport somehow. So, but now it's expensive, and it comes out of their paycheck. So it comes out of their other bills, and plus the drivers, like you say, are exploited. So the profit goes up to somebody else. And in order to make a living doing Uber, you have to drive 16 hours a day. So it's similar. You could run it similar to what we have now, just do it intentionally, like you say, and instead of without the exploitation.
Yeah, and again, just another weird little technical policy idea. I don't know if this would work, but it just occurred to me is like, you know how they have like the surge pricing and that sort of stuff? You could set up sort of like a inverse surge pricing thing where you incentivize people going to areas that don't have transit service and make it more expensive for you to call an Uber if there's if you're right by a bus stop. Like you actually like ride the bus as far as it goes and then switch to the Uber and you'll get a better deal kind of thing.
Right.
To like incentivize those climate pathways. But yeah, I don't know, just thinking out loud about how these things could like,
for sure.
I think there's we get really caught up in like these divisions of like, I think from a public policy perspective, people think of these as very, very distinct things, and rightfully so because of the labor conditions and stuff like that. And compared to buses, are often unionized, public, you know, good socialist proletarian buses versus, you know,
right.
But
versus the pseudo capitalist Uber driver.
Yeah, well, the aristocratic Uber managers and the Uber serfs, you know, getting their masks pulled off by lunatics and whatnot. But on that subject, getting your mask pulled off by a lunatic, it's that's something I wanted to talk to you about. And you got your shows about leftism and skepticism, and you know, I've remember the sort of the political developments of the last however many years, as we had this like sort of skeptic movement, and maybe you could talk a little more about this. We had the skeptic movement that had a really big fracture around the time of when we're dealing with first I guess sort of the Iraq War, and then moving into stuff like Gamergate and feminism and stuff like. And there was this real sort of fracture, and I considered myself part of the skeptic community as well. But I saw this and it was probably around 2014, 2015 when it really started getting very intense. Although there'd always been that sort of like, you know, Chris Hitchens supported the war in Iraq or whatever. Yeah, which
nobody really enjoyed that part of it. At least nobody I was involved with. But
yeah. So I'm curious about how you... In your experience I know you've been podcasting over this time too, like how that bifurcation where you have the sort of, a lot of, I guess, former left skeptics are maybe lowercase s skeptics now, as they focus on the left or something like that because of that association. But I think it's also really important, obviously, to have that rigor and make sure that we're not just, you know, as Carl Sagan says, you know, if you fall for a charlatan, you often get invested in what the charlatan's trying to sell you so much that no one can convince you otherwise. And I think that remains true today.
We're so hardcore into that. Society is right in that right now.
Yeah. We're seeing it really, really, the danger, like, Carl Sagan was right about that, you know, he was like, we're heading towards a potential era of darkness where charlatans lead the day, and people's investment in charlatans make them unwilling to hear reason and facts. And it definitely seems to be where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, like in 2016, I still felt there was like a movement, even though you could feel that rift happening. And then like right around that time, I did a series of podcast interviews where I discussed social justice with people who were pro-social justice or who would have been labeled social justice warriors. And I did, and with people who were anti-social justice warriors, and both like almost entirely out of the atheist and skeptic community. And one thing that kept popping up was like, if we do not figure out how to navigate this, then the skeptical community is done. The atheist community is done. And then YouTube skepticism, like it really caught a huge surge for a little bit there. And it seemed to be like anybody who wasn't, then you really had to pick a side. It was, you were on board with social justice, and that means that you believed in systemic racism, and you believed in patriarchy, and or rather you accepted the evidence of these things, or you denied them and became like the social justice version of a science denier, or a climate change denier, or anti-vaxxer. And a lot of our skeptical community was apparently just so invested in being smarter than other people that they could not accept that they were wrong on certain things.
Right.
And I mean, I remember feeling like that superiority, that I'm smarter than everybody kind of feeling, until I started exploring these subjects in depth. And then I was like realizing like, okay, well, I better accept how little I know, because there's all these people who have this experience that I know I don't have, explaining things to me that I know I've never seen. Well, I mean, you can maybe apply that same logic to like something supernatural per se, but then there's also like research done on various social issues, and like there's papers with evidence, and it's not just an anecdotal, I saw a ghost. It's no, racism exists and here's the evidence for it. You know? So I don't know. It's still hard though. Separating fact from fiction and knowing what's true, and like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that got to what you were getting at, but
no, totally. I'm fascinated too for like your perspective on this, because I'd seen I guess like I guess fairly early on I'd been convinced of some issues related to, say, like in particular sexism and then racism, in that order, I'm embarrassed to say, but I had to be convinced of the severity of these things. And the you know, as a young person, I'd been raised in this very like colorblind and gender blind society. And I remember it really being sort of a unpleasant, you know, an unpleasant, can I swear?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
An unpleasant mindfuck when I realized that I had been misogynistic for as long as I could remember in my actions. And that like upon reflection, the way that we talked in groups as a child was kind of disturbing. To think about some of the details of what passed in the elementary school or in the high school. So I get the desire to hold on against that. But people who made it past the Trump election still holding on to it are a certain type, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like during that first bit, when Trump was first elected, and you had like this rift was, I mean, it was still there. There was a lot of people discussing these things, and I lost a lot of friends the more and more I accepted the evidence for like systemic racism and patriarchy and like these things. And it was, I mean, everybody stopped at a certain point, right? Like you could say, okay, well, I accept the evidence for, you know, sexism in this case, but it's not a big deal over the whole thing. There's no such thing as rape culture, stuff like that. Like you could accept one case of sexism, but microaggressions are bullshit, you know, stuff like that. Like everybody had their line where they stopped, except for, well, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but, and some people just kept going and going and going. And then you find, like we found on the left, atheist, left skeptic communities, that the people who stayed behind and stayed in those more right-wing perspectives were suddenly using like those same kind of like arguments that we used to hear from conservatives all the time that were anti-LGBT. It was all this dishonest like framing of things where, oh, well, if we, I guess it's veiled like great replacement theory stuff. Is what it ends up coming down to. Yeah, it's bizarre.
No, yeah, and it is troubling in as a young person identifying with people in sort of a peer group like that, and then reaching that rupture point where you see, like, first of all, you have to sort of address in yourself, hey, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe there is good times for me to listen and not talk, and maybe there is good times to take seriously other people's like descriptions of harm that have been done to them, because it's like that. And I think for in the atheist sort of skeptic community, that was it was sort of a point of pride in like the early 2000s atheist sort of skeptic community, that to I guess be emphasizing all the harm that actually wasn't being done. So it's sort of like there's an early proto trigger culture in like triggering Christians because it's so innocuous, and that was sort of, there's space for different people to all get together around sort of like trolling Christians for different reasons. But then when you start applying it to like people who are, disadvantaged or suffering, talking about some way that they've been unfairly treated, and then taking the same tactic against them. It becomes this very twisted thing.
Right.
Well, on this broad subject, the thing, I in 2021, I was like, on New Year's, I was like, okay, this has been 1 year like this, and I'm just going to be really pessimistic and assume there's going to be another 2 like this. Like, how do I make a better use of, how do I take a better grasp of this moment? And I found myself thinking more and more about the reality bifurcation issue, the anti-maskers, the anti-COVID,
Right.
the election fraud in the United States, allegations from like the Trump supporters and all this. And it seemed to me this was going on all through 2020. And I saw people I knew who were, I wouldn't say they were well grounded before this, but they're certainly in a totally different place now in a bad way as a result
Right.
of all the isolation, the COVID stuff, the Trump stuff, all this sort of stuff. And in 2021, I was kind of like, I need to wrap my head around this reality bifurcation thing and like how truth works and like what, like how, I need to be able to articulate this better. And so that's been, I guess, one of my intellectual fixations this year, which is another reason I was really excited to talk to you, because I was curious to hear your thoughts or experiences on the COVID isolation guy who was already sort of a conspiracy theorist becoming like, I'm not sure if you know anyone like this, but I know of 2 or 3 off the top of my head who I could say are sort of in that category. COVID really just pushed them in a different direction for the worse. And I've become more and more concerned about the religious nature of these convictions.
Yeah. I'm not, as much as I've tried to come up with a good insight into this, I don't really have a great insight. I know, like, I mean, we're all alienated, right? We're all isolated, and we've been told that we're supposed to stand up on our own, but now we're in a situation where we have to rely on everybody around us doing something. And I think you combine that with this idea that, like, because we've also all been fed like hero narratives through our media for so long too, that if, like, the QAnon thing, it came along at a time where people were feeling all of these feelings, and it told them, you're a hero. All you have to do is be part of this group, and you're saving children, or you're saving the world. And of course, I mean, you add, like, they had to be pro-Trump in there, but somehow even though it attached to Trump, it somehow appealed to people who were previously anti-Trump through this alienation combined with a hero narrative, right? And I don't have a good solution by any stretch. It's really a tough problem to solve. I mean, I jokingly say to many people when they ask me, no, we're just fucked. Like, we just don't live in the same world, and there's no way to reconcile it. But if I truly believed that, I would quit doing anything. So I do somewhere in my head think that there is a way to reconcile this. It's just, we have to find that inroad. There's something there that we have to find to appeal to people that's based on reality. Like, I don't know, what about reality do you find appealing? What do you find appealing about, living within the most evidence-based world that you can live in? And that,
Yeah, there is a way to, because part of the appeal of the conspiracy theory is getting to be the special boy who's, sees behind the curtain. And I wonder if, there was a guy that I was arguing online with in like a Facebook group, sort of a friend of a friend thing. And a mutual friend of ours was like, you just have to sort of recognize this guy's just kind of narcissistic. He's never going to be able to read anything that contradicts him and hear it. But I was like, I had this little, maybe naive hope where I'm like, okay, maybe he is really self-centered and all of his posts are about looking in a metaphorical mirror about how much he's got it figured out. But where's that really like coming from in society? He doesn't have any political voice. So like his best political voice is to choose between Biden and Trump. So it really makes sense. About half the time people are going to pick one of them, like, so maybe it's not so horrifying and crazy that people that we know in left-wing cities like Wooks or whatever are voting for Trump. Maybe it's not that freaky. Maybe it's just like, oh, you gave him 2 options and, second option bias, and low information voters are like, the second guy, Biden, I heard this bad thing about from this other guy. And,
I mean, I don't want to like imagine it as like, this is, education is what's going to solve it though, right? Like, I don't think that it's necessarily, about giving them the information. I think we have to like actually give them hope, give people some reason to believe in what's true, and give them something to look forward to in society. Like, that's actually part of why I like the utopian vision of your show, because, and that's part of why I'm an anarcho-communist, or, you know, I identify that way, because I believe in, I came to this vision of a better world that needs to be possible. And I think, as villainized as communism and anarchism are, I think that some way of framing that as a future for society and as for individuals with flourishing lives, I really think that that's the best way we can go forward, and connect with people.
Right. Yeah. The sort of, how we treat people in those situations, it's hard to make a general, like, we should across society type thing. But when it comes to like people in our own families or communities, I think there is there's a lot of benefit of the doubt we can give people who fall far off the path, in terms of, especially on that personal level. I mean, like, I'm not talking about, you know, like, it's all of our job to be like a soul saver going around saving people from, you know, delusional thinking or something like that. Through
the more of those there are, the better.
Sure. And if you're good at it, please share your tips.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like people in our lives, I think there's a lot of room for just keeping that loving space open, where when they have those doubts, that they know that you're not against them, and that they can talk to you, and that they can sort of think through the questions that they have, and where sometimes you can almost, I know, like, for people I know who I've seen really change their perspective on some of these big issues we're talking about, like, you know, patriarchy, institutional racism, you know, the transatlantic slave trade and all this sort of stuff, that when you have like a good historical basis, you're like, okay, I get why people are so upset about this stuff, and it's important. Like, in the times where I've seen people make good progress on that, sometimes it's been through sort of the early guise of a thought experiment, of just like thinking through the other side and thinking about how it's internally consistent, and thinking about sort of where they're coming from. And you can sort of approach it from, with the right person at least, that sort of like steel manning perspective of like, if you really want to argue against the SJWs, you should know their arguments better than they do. And if you try to do it with social justice, like, now you're on the team, because it's just like the other side is much worse arguments, honestly.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, when I think of utopia, for the utopian response to the dystopian reality bifurcation of the 2020 sphere, I've got some beginnings of ideas, although I'm still actively in the process, I would say.
Right.
I don't have any big golden gem I can show, but gems are never gold, actually, come to think of it. Gem and gold are different things. But
gold nugget, sure.
But one thing is like the process of science. I think there's some really good critiques about the way that resources are distributed, and the way that replication doesn't always happen, and the way that, you know, I've read very detailed critiques of this kind of stuff that I can't relay off the top of my head, but there is a real case to make that there's problems with the institutions of truth as they currently exist, and that they're at the very least sort of disproportionately walled off. Science isn't a public affair. It's not something you can just walk up off the street and be like, hey, I got an idea for an experiment, guys. Like, our scientific community doesn't work that way. And it seems to me that it would be ideal to try to bridge the gap between a very institutionalized and dare I say, like, aristocratic finance-based sphere of science, where, you know, funding is coming for people wanting to develop products and stuff like that, or, you know, limited funding in universities or different contexts, but not enough money to go around for all of the experimentation that would naturally go on if we really just, you know, unlock the gate and said, hey, humanity, do as much science as you want. Everyone can be involved. We're going to train you up. We're going to get you involved in different processes. We're going to start you off on small things that aren't dangerous, you know, as part of group things. But if you want to be involved, you can. That process could teach us to a higher level. And I feel like I've got an okay idea about this as an outsider, but most people don't, which is the process of the feeling out of the possibilities that science is really a great part about, is considering what the possible options could be and then figuring out ways to test which of those options is more likely, and then finding ways to look at, experiments other people have done and said, is there an issue with this? Is there a way that we can reframe this?
Yeah.
Or ask slightly different questions to see if we're really measuring what we think we're measuring. And like, I feel like if everyone could be involved in that process in a higher degree, and I don't know the exact way to do it, it would be a lot harder for people to have the wrong types of conspiracy theories about science and institutions of science. It'd be a lot harder for people to think, oh, this is all some big pharma conspiracy. The entirety of all medical research is just inherently a lie because it's done by politicians or something.
It's like on some level, people who participated in the vaccine trials, right? Like once they were in that vaccine trial, it was like, okay, well, not only did they learn about the vaccine more, but then they're more... Where can people find you?
Yeah, so SrsllyWrong.com, that's SRSLY wrong.com. Our podcast Seriously Wrong is also on like iTunes and Stitcher, any place where you can get podcasts, on YouTube as well. And later this year in fall, probably, we haven't got a release date yet, but I'll also have a new cartoon show on Means TV, the anti-capitalist streaming service. So later this year, I'm really excited to share. I've been working on it for about a year now. And it is, crazy cartoon adventures for an anti-capitalist audience, family friendly, awesome. Some episodes PG, mostly G. So I'm excited to share that. Yeah. And, the Seriously Wrong is what we do most of the time.
And it's a great show. Like, I've been listening pretty avidly for, I don't know, a while now, ever since it was introduced to me by, a friend of my old show, Jesse Hoffner. He tagged you on a tweet and he said, "Hey, here's a podcast you might like." And I was like, "Hey."
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm really glad to hear it. And yeah, it's cool to hear that because yeah, our paths crossed in an earlier life, where I was sort of like a politician, talking to you one time,
right?
And sort of riffing about sort of similar ideas. And then you also caught me on the next orbit with the podcast. That's really neat.
And I guess at the time I still identified with anarchism at the time, but more of a like centrist capitalist anarchism. And, I prefer the anarchism I have now. So,
right. Well, my co-host Aaron is also really in a similar, category of coming into, through skepticism, anarchism. And then he had a little bit of a utopian thing because he also connected with the Zeitgeist movement when that was a big thing.
Oh yeah.
So he really liked that sort of like vision of an alternate society they put forward. But yeah, he similarly came from this sort of like centrist anarchist. Well, maybe, and early in our show, we did that same sort of thing you mentioned of like trying to find like, the both sides, like let's feel it out kind of thing. And,
right.
But then he had the same process, I think, that a lot of us did over the last, 5-6 years of just the strength of the evidence and the not just the evidence, but also like the ethical pull of knowing, of feeling like the evidence backs the ethical pull and the ethical feeling like a lot disproportionately, even sometimes better than you might guess, from the outside. Like there's a lot of evidence for a lot of these things. But ultimately I think we're driven to this stuff because it feels too dirty to be apart from it. It just feels too wrong to not be a part of trying to make the world a better place like that. Once you see it, it's just hard to be like, oh, never mind. I'm just really gonna.
It's fine. Somebody will take care of it.
Yeah.
No, awesome. Well, thank you for joining me.
Well, yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, folks. I'm sorry to say it, but this is where the interview has to get cut off right now for non-patrons. For patrons, you can go for $1 a month, or I think it's $1.50 Canadian, and get the full interview. And honestly, like I said at the intro, if you email me because you are so interested in the rest of this conversation that you need to hear the other half of it, then I will email it to you. Like, as much as I think that I want to have some incentive for people to become patrons, I just don't feel right not giving you the content if you actually want it. Up next is the very first in what I hope is a long-running series of book reviews that we are titling Socialist Reviews with Justin Clark. My friend Justin Clark likes to read a lot, and he's interested in, tends to write reviews for his website, which is justinclark.org. And for his blog there, he writes reviews about various books that he reads. And I thought that it would be great to include him in this, in the show, and give you 15 to 30 minutes of a book review information on something he's read recently. So without further ado, here is Socialist Reviews with Justin Clark. Okay, so I guess this is a new segment for the show. We're going to talk about, I don't have a name for it yet, but we're going to talk about a book that you have reviewed or are going to review. So, socialist book reviews.
Yeah. Left review, read left review. I don't know, something like that. Something along those lines. Yeah. But yeah, I'm Justin Clark. I'm a public historian. I live in Indiana here in the U.S. And I'm also the political education co-chair for Central Indiana DSA. And so one of the things that's really important to me in my life is books, as if you couldn't tell from behind me. And so I think every other couple of weeks, you and I will meet and talk for a little bit about a book that I've read. Yep. Some of these will be more positive and sort of like fun, and some of them will be more kind of, I think, critical. So like this one tonight's going to be like really fun and like light and interesting.
The good first one, the very positive first one. And then the next one's going to be the one where you watch me rip a book a new asshole. So that's that's going to be. I actually just finished the written version of that review. That's up on my blog. For those who are interested in the next time we meet, we'll be talking about Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell. And I did sort of a retrospective review of that because the book turned 15. So I was sort of looking back as, did his central claims hold up? Spoiler alert, they didn't. And so that's kind of what we'll be doing next time. But tonight, we're going to be doing a much more fun read, something that's way more in my wheelhouse, which is this awesome novel. We're starting with a novel called The Ministry for the Future. And this is by the legendary science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson. Robinson is probably best known for the Mars trilogy, which he wrote in the 90s. One of the things about Robinson that's really cool is he takes two things that I really love and kind of puts them together. One of them is science fiction, which I'm a huge science fiction guy. I love science fiction. I'm a big Star Trek fan. I love Philip K. Dick's books. I love Ray Bradbury and Kim Stanley Robinson does a lot of what we call hard sci-fi, where he's sort of keeping up with the latest science and then using some of the latest science to extrapolate a sort of plausible version of something. So, for example, in the Mars trilogy, he uses the most updated science at the time, which in the early 90s, to basically plot out like what would a human mission to Mars actually be like. Now, many science fiction authors had done this in the past. Most notably people like Robert Heinlein or Arthur C. Clarke. But what Robinson does is he sort of lays out like what it would take to get there. And over the series of 3 books,
he not only plots out like the science of what's going on, but it also pairs with the other component of his work that I really love, which is politics. He's a radical socialist, and he's a member of the DSA. He has been a socialist for many, many, many years. And so he always pairs his science fiction work with a sense of radical politics. And the Ministry for the Future is definitely one of those. The other thing that's interesting about him in the last probably 10 or so years of his work, I mean, it's always been a major component of his work, but over the last 10, 15 years has been his emphasis on talking about climate change. And the Ministry for the Future is all about climate change. Basically, it's what he describes as the best case scenario over the next 2 to 3 decades of what could happen with climate change.
If we address climate change and
yes, if we actually address it, if there's like a political movement behind it where things start to move.
Right.
And so he posits a lot of different kind of scenarios in the book, and some different technologies we can kind of get into. But the central thrust about his writing that I really love is it has this sort of humanist streak through it. So he's writing realistically, but he's also writing optimistically in the sense that he's sort of saying, like, if we do these things, this is how this might work out. Okay. And ultimately, he definitely believes that humans are capable of solving our own problems, which is something that I find very rewarding, not just as a writer, but just as a person, that I think that it's important for us to get beyond this idea that we can't solve our own problems. Right. I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in politics, and a lot of it, and especially I think on the left. What I think he does is he sort of reinvigorates that optimistic spirit, because that's what we're supposed to be. And I think this is something we talked about the last time we chatted.
Right.
And so that's kind of a kind of an overview of kind of what it is. So it's this kind of sprawling epic that has a lot of politics, it has a lot of science, and it has a lot of like sort of human moments scattered throughout. And there's sort of 2 main characters, and we can kind of talk about those. But I don't know if this is a question and answer thing. I'm not sure how you want to set this up.
I mean, so far you've answered everything that I've thought of as we're going.
Okay.
Yeah, like if you like, I was just about going to ask, is it like through the eyes of a particular character?
Yeah, so it's through the eyes. I would say there's probably 2 main characters in the book. There are many other sort of ancillary characters, but there's really 2.
Okay.
So one of them is the first character you meet. It's a guy named Frank May. And the book opens with a massive catastrophic event in India where there's a massive heat wave that leads to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay.
And he's one of the survivors. So the book opens with this story of him basically wading out into, I'm not sure if it's the Ganges River or not, but some kind of body of water. And he's basically like, it cools it down enough so that he can survive the night. And when he wakes up, he's just surrounded by corpses.
Oh, geez. In
the water. And so the book kind of follows his life for the next 20, 30 years. And so it radicalizes him. And his character arc eventually kind of collides with the other major character in the novel, which is a woman named Mary Murphy.
Okay.
And Mary is, I think, from Scotland or Ireland. I think she's from Ireland. And she's the head of what's called the Ministry for the Future. So in the book, what the Ministry for the Future is it's like this enforcement arm of the Paris Climate Accord. So imagine a future where the Paris Climate Agreement actually has some kind of teeth to it. And there's an actual enforcement arm that basically creates policy. And that's what she heads. And she meets Frank because at one point he basically kidnaps her. So he sort of radicalizes because of his experiences. He suffers from PTSD. And he joins this sort of radical outfit called the Children of Kali, which is kind of like an ISIS or like a Al-Qaeda kind of thing.
Okay.
And he sort of does it tangentially, because like the Children of Kali are like, he's not really ours. Like he's kind of a one-off guy doing his own thing. Like we do organized work. He's not, and he's also white, right? So like, it's like the whole insider outsider thing, which I think is important to note, that like, he's kind of like, I'm going to speak for you, But he basically kidnaps He basically kidnaps Mary in her apartment. And instead of him like hurting her or like killing her or anything like that, they end up having this conversation. And basically he's saying, your people are not doing enough. You're not doing enough. You fancy ass people, because the Ministry for the Future is, it's stationed in Switzerland. And so he's like, you fancy ass people, you're in Switzerland, you're just twiddling your thumbs. I've experienced how bad this is. When are you going to do something?
Right.
And this is a very sort of cathartic moment for Mary. So instead of her sort of reacting how we would imagine most sort of government bureaucrats as, she has a certain level of empathy for him. And she recognizes like, oh my God, this man's life has been ruined by the very thing we're trying to solve. And so the book kind of follows their lives as they interact with one another. So when he gets caught, as he eventually does,
right,
he goes to prison. Well, prison in Switzerland is like nothing, right?
It's not bad.
it's nothing, right? Like it's basically like a nice little like resort, you know.
Right.
But he starts to be a volunteer in a refugee camp. So one of the central themes of the book is climate refugees and how that's going to be a real world issue that we're going to have to solve. And so he becomes close with a refugee family, and he sort of raises this woman's daughter as his own, and they're sort of close. And this is all the while. So this is kind of the very human, personal stuff of the book. And then the other stuff in the book is like the political stuff, where Mary Murphy's like meeting with governments, and she's developing like different avenues of how we can solve the problem. So there's different concepts in the book that could be kind of real world examples of what we could do. One of them is that Robinson talks about is the idea of a carbon coin. So imagine a universal currency that would have the kind of weight like the US dollar or say the Chinese renminbi or yuan, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically that you tie the value of this coin to keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Okay. And so the more that you sequester and just keep oil or natural gas in the ground, the more carbon coin you get and the more value it actually has. And so governments around the world sort of organize around this carbon coin concept, and they give it the sort of institutional weight that it would need, right? And what ultimately happens is a lot of companies basically just get out of the oil business. And so there's this kind of very optimistic moment where the oil companies basically retool, and they start sort of retrofitting their facilities to instead of moving oil, they move water, which is another component of the book, which is there's an interesting side plot of the book, which is why you see this like giant tunnel on the cover. Is that one of the technologies that Robinson explores in the book is the idea of basically terraforming glaciers at the Arctic poles. So one of the ways that we could keep glaciers is actually boring into them and then basically creating a pressure valve where water shoots back through that's melted and refreezes. So that it so basically cycles through and continually recharges the glacier so that it doesn't fully melt and that the water levels don't rise. And this is all based on real science. This is all theoretical stuff that people are sort of working through. Right. Which is very, very interesting. The other thing that's interesting about his book, and the cover also kind of gives it away, is you might notice on the cover there's a Zeppelin. Those become a thing again. And those are because they're easier to run, and they're sort of run on, I think, solar panels or something.
Right. As opposed to fossil fuels. So there's a lot of so for like the wonky, nerdy Vox crowd, there's enough of that shit in this book to get them excited. Right. And then for like sci-fi nerds like me, there's enough to get you excited. If you're interested in following the human characters, there's enough to get you excited. And then if you're a radical, sort of a left radical, there's a lot in the book to get you excited. Like basically India goes communist. So because of the horrible heat wave, the BJP, which is the current government, the current party that rules India today under Modi, the sort of far right nationalist, some would say proto-fascist party, is kicked out.
they're absolutely destroyed. And there's a left coalition that is developed, which is led by the Indian Communist Party, which for a lot of people who know in the real world, in our world, the Indian Communist Party is actually one of the strongest communist or left parties in the world. It basically runs the state of Kerala in India. And one of the things that they institute is more sort of restorative agriculture. So they move away more from the sort of big ag elements that would lead to sort of environmental destruction. And they go back to more sort of traditional methods of agriculture. So it's a mix of like cutting edge science with like traditional methods, right?
Okay.
Because one of the ways that we often talk about this discussion in our lives is that like it's either sort of ancient wisdom versus science or technology. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I think what Robinson tries to show is that like there are traditions that are worth saving from the past that are worthwhile mixed with good cutting edge science. And that's kind of what it is. There's a resurgence of Sovietism in Russia. So Russia's kind of moving away from being the sort of autocratic pseudo-feudalism that it is today back, more to sort of the best version of like Soviet Bolshevism of sort of Lenin's era. So that's another component of the book. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but we can get into that. I know I've kind of gone off your original question, but yeah, but that's kind of, and like I said, it's truly a sprawling book. I mean, it's a book that covers like 4 decades. It takes place all over the world. And the book is like, kind of has nonlinear storytelling where it kind of jumps around a lot. And within the main narrative of the book, there's these like 2 or 3 page chapters where he just explains things. Like, so he explains like what ideology is, or he explains like what neoliberalism is. And he kind of explains sort of what's going on as the book goes through. That's interesting.
Like, I guess you sort of, as you were explaining it, I was thinking, well, where does the radical politics come into this? So that's really neat.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I haven't even talked about one of the more interesting parts of the book, which is that there's basically a dark wing of the Ministry for the Future.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So Mary has a partner that she sort of works with in the ministry that has, for those who are fans of Star Trek, they basically have their own version of Section 31. And Section 31 will do the dark work that no one else is willing to do. And this is sort of inspired by her encounter with Frank, who kidnaps her. Like, he's like, you're not doing enough. You need to push it. You need to more. And so what this sort of radical wing does, and it's never clear exactly what they do.
Right.
But it's sort of implied that basically they essentially put pressure on fossil fuel executives to basically give up. Because if not, we'll make your life a living hell.
Right.
And then throughout the book, like, just mysterious deaths happen where like some oil executive will end up dead or
and nobody says that it's them. But.
Yeah. Or some billionaire philanthropist ends up dead, that kind of thing. And I think that's kind of interesting. And so, what he's essentially advocating for in the book is like moving away from the sort of neoliberal model to truly a planned economy. He throughout the book, he sort of advocates like there's this conversation Mary has with some of these monetary people where she has to convince them to like be on board with the carbon coin, and which is arguably not particularly a socialistic idea, but it's one that sort of gets the ball rolling in terms of incentive structures.
Right.
Because that's the thing that's important for Robinson is like he's thinking about things through in real time. Like, okay, like what would this be like 10 years from now? Like we're going to still live with much of what we were living through in capitalism. So how can we shape capitalism to be better and get us onto the road to socialism? Right. And then at some point in the book, he basically just lays out like the only way we're going to do this is through planning. The only way this is going to work is through planning and through essentially socialism. And that's what was laid out later in the book. And that's, in many ways, that is exactly what happens. You have, massive investments in public infrastructure, part of which is the sort of the polar ice caps or glacial restoration work. And then you see political transformations. So basically governments start becoming more objectively left wing, whether it's in India or Russia or Latin America. And then even to some extent the United States. I mean, that's like my only criticism of the book, is that it seems like there's never a scene where like you see the president of the United States talking to someone. Like that doesn't happen.
Okay.
Or like the American thing is like, he almost sort of assumes that Americans are going to fuck this up. So he sort of, and so he kind of, he sort of definitely has like sort of internationalist perspective where he thinks like the people who are really going to do this are like China and India. And like, those are the people who are going to do this more. So that's kind of where the radical stuff comes in. Okay.
No, that's interesting. I don't know how, have you read anything on the science of this, rejuvenation of the, glaciers? Like, that's really interesting to me, but I'm not sure, like, it would be so complicated to figure out.
Yeah. Only sort of what I remember, Robinson did a Q&A with DSA, I think a month or two ago, where he outlined a little bit of it, where he was getting it mostly through newspaper articles. So I read a little bit of that. And it is fairly theoretical, but they're sort of trying to figure out some of the rudimentary stages of how that would work. And so I think it's a science that like would require massive public investment in to really get off the ground.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I haven't looked into it as much as I maybe should have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
tell you.
I'm just curious. It sounds really interesting.
It's one of the, I think scientifically, it's the most interesting concept of the book. I mean, it's this like idea of like essentially terraforming, and it's sort of a baseline version of terraforming, which is kind of interesting because that's going to be the long-term problem.
Yeah.
Is that as the glaciers and the polar ice caps melt, you're going to have two problems, which is one, you're going to have the acidification of the oceans, which is already beginning. And then two, you're going to have basically local climate cycles being completely messed up because the polar ice caps no longer exist. So there's, so cities are going to disappear, wildlife's going to disappear. And so, essentially the book is optimistic, but it also lays out that like, this is going to suck, but this version of it sucks less than what would happen if we do nothing, because essentially right now we're doing nothing. Yeah. And and I think, more than any other book, this book has really underscored the importance of climate change to me. Because for many years, like I was kind of like, whatever. And especially when I had like garbage politics, when I was more of like the Steven Pinker bent, I just said, we'll solve that, move on. Who cares? Like,
right. Science will do something eventually.
Science will do something eventually, whatever. But what Robinson, and I think what makes him overtly political and radical, and I think on the political left, is that he says like the way for us to actually move the needle on the science is through direct public investment. It's going to require governments to coordinate and work together to do this. And more importantly, it's going to take a revitalization of democracy to do this. And so that's where I think a lot of the radical elements of the book come from. It's very interesting. He's a guy who gets a lot of praise from both, people like me, Marxists or socialists, but also people of the sort of nerdy, boxy crowd I talked about earlier kind of like him, because he kind of goes into the details of like, okay, well, what would this actually look like? And so, the other thing is like, there are other interesting technologies that are more radical. He talks about the reinvigoration of public banking. He talks about how there's something called Your Lock, which is basically a Facebook, but that you own, and you own your own data and then can sell it to someone if you want and make money off of it. So like there's that, and in the book, Your Lock become a central point of communications between people. It's basically, and it's owned by the government. So like it's democratically owned by the people and the government respectively. So imagine like a WhatsApp, but nationalized. Like that's kind of what it is.
Right.
And so the book kind of like, it kind of hints at the idea that like, we're going to shut Facebook down and replace it with this, which I think is great. Like I think the idea of shutting down Facebook and replacing it with like a public alternative that's owned by the public, I think is a really cool idea.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's little just stuff throughout the book that's kind of like that. So it's a book that hinges on details, but also has the big picture too.
That's awesome. So is there anything you want to mention before we consider this book review finished?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I won't give away much of the ending. The book I will say it doesn't have like antagonists in like the normal sense. Like it doesn't have like a big baddie that like you have to hate.
Climate change is the
climate change is the baddie.
Right.
So like, there are famines, there are, horrible weather events, there are mass deaths, like there's all kinds of horrible shit going on. But ultimately the book is a book of hope. And I think for those on the left, I think one of the things that I think is important about the book, and whether you think he goes far enough is a whole other question, but like basically what he's saying is we need to start thinking about what it would look like if we actually started to do this. That we, it's not enough to just say like the oil companies are bad and we should like go away from fossil fuels. Like that's a part of it, right? But that's only a part of the equation. Like you have to think about, industrial agriculture. You have to think about, ecosystems. You have to think about glaciation. All those different components are important. So he thinks through them, and ultimately, it's a book where humanity kind of succeeds, and which I think is kind of lovely.
Sounds good.
In an era where apocalyptic visions are something that are pretty normal, it's just kind of nice to have something that isn't. So,
no kidding.
I highly recommend it. I think it's a great read. It's a quick read for short chapters. It zips by pretty quickly. I couldn't recommend it more. I think it's the book for people to read about like a possible future, a good future about climate change.
Cool. No, that sounds good.
Great.
Is there, as we were just talking here, I was thinking, do you want to do like a kind of rating system?
Yeah, we can do that. So, we can sort of match it to my Goodreads review. I'm pretty generous with my reviews, especially like if I like the book. So I think I gave this like a 5 out of 5 stars. If I was going to be more discerning, I would maybe give it like a 4 or 4.5. Sort of, with my criticisms, my main criticism of the book being that like the United States is like a component, but it's not as big a component. I feel like that's something that needs to be said. So that would be kind of my other quibble. And then just on a narrative level, it's a book that does jump around a lot. And if you can figure out like his syntax or like sometimes he's very direct as a writer. Sometimes he's very poetic. Sometimes he's very metaphorical. Sometimes he's very literal. Like it's all over the place. So it's not like a very simple, it's easy to read because it's quick, but it's not like, it doesn't move the way a traditional novel would in that kind of sense, because it's jumping all around. So if that's something that might be difficult for you, then I just kind of let you know for that. So yeah, I would say, 4.5 stars, something like that out of 5.
It's not a perfect book, but it's very, very good.
It's damn near perfect. I mean, it's pretty great. I mean, I will certainly be able to give you a better star rating for the next book we do. But yeah, so I highly recommend it. People check it out. It's eco-socialism. I'm getting more and more into that kind of reading, so it's good stuff.
Yeah. No, sounds good. Well, I guess thank you for your review of this. What was the book again? Title?
The book is called The Ministry for the Future by Ken Stanley Robinson. We'll find
our local socialist bookstore so you can find.
Yeah, it's published by Orbit Books. You can probably get it directly through them.
Yeah, probably.
If you want to avoid giving Bezos money, you might be able to get it through Red Emma's, the cooperative bookstore in Maryland.
Definitely worth checking out.
And give it a read for sure.
Awesome.
And if you don't mind, I just figured I'd do a little bit of plugs if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
All right. So if you're interested in learning more about the DSA, I highly recommend people check out if you're in the States. I'm a member of Central Indiana DSA. I'm a part of the leadership. So, if you're in the Indiana area, you're interested in learning about DSA, you can always reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at Justin Clark PH for public history. And you can always reach out to me there. That's where I do this sort of formal book reviews and other things like that. And you can also check out everything about me on my website, justinclark.org, which I promise you I didn't pick to be pretentious. It's just .com was taken and .net seemed cheap. So I went with .org.
Yeah. Those .coms are always so expensive.
Yeah, they are. And I'm not really selling anything. So,
No.
So yeah. And then I would just say, you know, check out my blog there. I've got a bunch of different articles up there. My latest article is my retrospective review of Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, which we'll cover next time. So if you're interested in sort of getting my point of view before seeing me on here in a couple weeks, you can read that.
Perfect. All right. That's it. Thank you, comrades, for listening or watching if you're watching us on YouTube. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work quite as many hours on the gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. Yes, I know, that's not the name of this show, that's the name of the show I used to run. And they don't let you change your PayPal. So, if you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my Linktree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as my links to my other shows, which includes Skeptarchy, which is a panel show that I do with a group of very smart people. From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast which I do with a partner about Saskatchewan politics. And The Feminist Family, which I do with my life partner about our lives, our philosophies, and living in a feminist household. My Twitter is @HardcoreSkeptic, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests, or you can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening or watching, and remember, the truth leans left.